I still remember the exact moment my stomach dropped because it wasn't the quiet street or the way my neighbors suddenly avoided eye contact. It was the bright white sign planted dead center in my front lawn that read, "For sale," in bold letters, with the HOA logo stamped neatly in the corner, and for a second I honestly thought I'd walked up to the wrong house, except the blue shutters, the cracked stepping stone, and the dented mailbox were unmistakably mine. And as I stood there frozen with my grocery bags digging into my fingers, a woman across the street quickly ducked back behind her curtain like she'd been caught watching something she shouldn't. And that's when the confusion turned into something darker, because I hadn't listed my home, I hadn't spoken to a realtor, and I definitely hadn't authorized the HOA to put anything on my property. Yet there it was, perfectly straight, professionally printed, like a quiet announcement that I no longer belonged. And before I could even process what was happening, my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA portal. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Before we start, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? And what's your HOA horror story? Let's jump into today's episode, titled Community Update, where in two carefully worded sentences they mention that certain properties may soon be transitioning ownership, and that residents were reminded to maintain compliance during sensitive periods, which felt less like information and more like a warning. And as I scrolled through the neighborhood group chat, I saw the whispers starting already. People asking if I was moving, others joking that maybe I'd finally had enough, and one message from an HOA board member simply saying, "Change can be good." Which made my hands shake because change wasn't something I'd chosen. It was something being pushed onto me, slowly and quietly, the way the HOA always did things. And this wasn't the first sign either, because for months now I'd been receiving notices for the smallest things, trash cans being visible for an extra hour, mulch that was apparently the wrong shade of brown, a porch light deemed too bright, violations that never seemed to apply to anyone else on the block, especially not the board members or their friends. And when I finally marched up to the sign and pulled it out of the ground, my neighbor Tom leaned over the fence and whispered that he'd seen two HOA officers installing it earlier that morning, clipboard in hand, acting like they owned the place. And when I asked him why he hadn't said anything, he looked genuinely uncomfortable and said, "They told us it was already approved," which was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy, because the HOA had always been subtle with their pressure, never outright threats, just enough inconvenience and public embarrassment to make people give up and leave on their own. And as I carried the sign inside my house, I noticed a second envelope taped to my door. This one marked "Final Notice," stating that continued noncompliance could result in forced corrective actions, a phrase vague enough to be terrifying, and when I logged into the HOA account to look for answers, my access was suddenly restricted, replaced by a message saying my account was under review, cutting me off from records, votes, and communications, isolating me from the very system that governed my home. And standing there in my living room, staring at that screen, it finally clicked that the HOA wasn't just annoyed with me. They wanted me gone, because a quiet homeowner who asked too many questions about budgets, selective enforcement, and missing funds was inconvenient, and the easiest way to deal with inconvenient people wasn't confrontation, it was pressure, embarrassment, and isolation. And as I set the "For Sale" sign against the wall, I made a decision that would change everything. Because if the HOA thought they could scare me into leaving without a fight, they had badly underestimated how far I was willing to go once they crossed from petty rules into something far more personal. The next few days felt like I was living inside someone else's story, because no matter how often I reminded myself that I hadn't done anything wrong, the neighborhood treated me like a problem that was already half resolved, with people smiling politely but cutting conversations short, and others openly asking when my house would be listed for real, as if the HOA's fake sign had already rewritten reality. And when I tried emailing the board for an explanation, every message bounced back with the same automated reply about my account being under review, which only deepened the sense that this was coordinated, not careless. And it didn't take long for the pressure to escalate, because within a week I received a letter from a real estate company I'd never contacted, claiming they'd been informed I might be interested in selling and offering a discounted service for a quick exit. a phrase that made my chest tighten, because someone had clearly been feeding them information, and as I dug deeper, asking around quietly, I learned this wasn't the first time the HOA had done something like this, because two families on the far end of the street had moved out within months of similar treatment, both after repeated fines, public notices, and sudden for sale rumors. And while everyone said it was coincidence, the timing was too neat, too consistent, and when I finally cornered Linda, the HOA president, in the parking lot after a meeting I wasn't allowed to attend, she smiled with that practiced calm and said the sign must have been a misunderstanding, but her words didn't match her tone because she never once apologized or offered to correct it publicly, instead suggesting that maybe I should consider my options if the community no longer felt like a good fit, which was the moment I stopped believing this was about rules and started seeing it for what it was, a quiet campaign to push out someone they considered disruptive, and the more I looked, the clearer the pattern became, because every violation I'd received over the past year coincided with moments where I'd ask questions about HOA spending, contractor favoritism, and why certain homes were never cited, and while none of it was enough on its own to prove anything, together it painted a picture of selective enforcement designed to exhaust and isolate, and the final straw came when I returned home one evening to find the "for sale" sign back on my lawn, this time reinforced with concrete as if to send a message that pulling it out wouldn't make it go away, and taped to it was a flyer advertising an open house interest meeting, complete with a date and time, which crossed a line so clearly that even some neighbors finally spoke up, texting me in disbelief and anger, because now the HOA wasn't just implying I should leave, they were actively presenting my home as available, and when I called the number on the flyer, the agent on the other end sounded confused, saying they'd been told the HOA had full authorization due to ongoing compliance issues, a phrase so vague it could mean anything, and that's when I realized how dangerous this had become, because reputations, property values, and legal rights were being played with casually, all under the assumption that I'd eventually get tired and walk away, and that night, instead of sleeping, I sat at my kitchen table going through every letter, email, screenshot, and notice I'd ever received, laying them out in order, and for the first time I didn't just feel angry, I felt focused, because patterns that look harmless when isolated become damning when documented, and as the sun came up, I made a call I'd been putting off, scheduling a consultation with a housing attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and when she heard about the unauthorized sign, restricted access, and selective enforcement. There was a pause on the line before she said something that sent a chill through me, because she told me this wasn't just harassment, it was potentially discriminatory displacement, and that if the HOA thought this tactic would quietly erase me from the neighborhood, they had just handed me the leverage to do the exact opposite. The attorney moved fast in a way that immediately told me this wasn't her first time dealing with an HOA that thought it could bully someone into disappearing, and within days she had me signing records requests, drafting formal notices, and documenting everything from the placement of the sign to the timing of each violation, because she explained that pressure campaigns only work when they stay informal and deniable, and the moment you force them into writing, patterns start to scare people, and sure enough, the HOA's behavior shifted almost instantly, because instead of pretending nothing was wrong, they suddenly became overly polite, sending carefully worded emails about community harmony and miscommunication, while still refusing to explain who authorized the sign or why my account access was restricted, and as we waited for their responses, neighbors began stopping me quietly on my evening walks, some apologetic, others nervous, admitting they'd been warned not to get involved, that the board had told them property values could suffer if troublemakers stayed too long, which only confirmed what my attorney suspected, that this wasn't just about me, it was about setting an example. And the deeper we dug, the uglier it got, because HOA records revealed that enforcement actions were overwhelmingly concentrated on a small group of homeowners, most of whom shared similar backgrounds, similar income levels, or similar willingness to question authority, while others were effectively invisible to the rules. And when my attorney compared timelines, she noticed something chilling, because the two families who'd moved out after similar treatment had both received unauthorized sale-related communications shortly before leaving, and neither had ever officially listed their homes, meaning the HOA had quietly rewritten reality for them too, and when we requested copies of any agreements authorizing the use of HOA branding on sale materials, the board's lawyer responded with delays and vague denials, which only raised more red flags, and then, just when it felt like things couldn't get more brazen, I came home to find a printed notice taped to my door stating that failure to cooperate with community transition efforts could result in fines and corrective action, language so absurdly vague that my attorney laughed out loud when she read it, because she explained that coercion often hides behind ambiguous terms, hoping fear fills in the gaps. And as she prepared a formal cease and desist letter, word spread that the HOA was holding closed-door meetings without notifying certain homeowners, and although I wasn't invited, I found out through a neighbor that my name had come up repeatedly, framed as a liability risk and a negative influence, which stung more than I expected, because I'd lived there for years without incident until I started asking questions. And now suddenly I was being discussed like a defect to be removed, and when the cease and desist letter was delivered, demanding the immediate removal of the sign, restoration of my account access, and an explanation of the board's actions, the HOA's response was swift but telling, because instead of denying everything, they removed the sign quietly in the early morning hours, hoping no one would notice, and restored partial access to my account without explanation, which might have worked if my attorney hadn't warned me that silent reversals often mean panic, not innocence. And as neighbors began asking why the sign disappeared overnight, the HOA released a short statement blaming a clerical error. A claim that fell apart the moment someone shared photos of the reinforced concrete base, because mistakes don't usually come with cement, and that contradiction sparked something new, because people who'd stayed quiet before started comparing notes, realizing that many of them had experienced smaller versions of the same pressure, subtle nudges to fall in line or move on. And as that collective awareness grew, my attorney filed a formal complaint alleging discriminatory displacement, selective enforcement, and unauthorized representation of property for sale, a move that escalated everything from neighborhood gossip to a legal matter with real consequences, and the day the complaint was acknowledged by the housing authority, the HOA's tone shifted completely because fear has a sound to it, and I could hear it in their sudden urgency, their requests for meetings, their insistence that they wanted to resolve things amicably, and as my attorney told me to prepare for the next phase, one involving mediation, discovery, and public scrutiny, I realized the board's biggest mistake wasn't putting the sign on my lawn, it was assuming I'd quietly accept the story they wrote for me instead of forcing the truth into the open where everyone could see it. Mediation was scheduled faster than anyone expected, and the speed alone told me the HOA was scared of what discovery might uncover, because once lawyers start demanding internal emails and meeting minutes, stories collapse quickly, and when we entered the mediation room, the board members who once ignored my emails suddenly couldn't make eye contact, sitting stiffly beside their attorney while insisting this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But my attorney came prepared with timelines, photos, witness statements, and a pattern that was impossible to ignore, showing how enforcement actions spiked whenever a homeowner questioned fees, attended meetings too often, or challenged vague rules. And as she laid it out calmly, one document at a time, the mediator's expression changed because this wasn't a single bad decision. It was a coordinated effort to pressure certain residents into leaving without officially forcing them out, and when the unauthorized for-sale board came up again, the HOA attorney tried to argue it was placed by a third-party contractor acting independently, but that defense collapsed the moment my attorney presented an invoice showing the HOA paid for installation and materials using community funds, which caused one board member to mutter something under his breath before realizing the room had gone silent. And from that point on, the meeting felt less like negotiation and more like slow exposure, because every attempt to downplay their actions was met with another piece of evidence, another neighbor's statement, another inconsistency they couldn't explain, and when the topic of discrimination was raised directly, the board president stiffened and insisted the HOA treated everyone equally, but the data told a different story, showing that violations and fines disproportionately targeted a narrow group of homeowners while others received warnings or nothing at all. And the mediator asked a simple question that shifted everything, which was why no formal vote or notice existed authorizing the sale signage, and the room went quiet again because there was no answer that didn't admit wrongdoing, and after hours of back and forth, the HOA requested a private caucus, disappearing into another room for nearly an hour, leaving me and my attorney alone, where she explained that this pause usually meant internal panic because someone was realizing personal liability might be on the table. And when the board returned, their tone had changed completely. No more defensiveness, no more denials. Just careful language about wanting to avoid escalation, proposing a settlement that included removing all records of violations from my file and a modest payment, which my attorney immediately rejected because she explained that quiet settlements protect systems, not people. And as the negotiations continued, word leaked to the neighborhood that mediation was happening, and suddenly support I didn't expect began showing up in subtle ways, neighbors waving more openly, someone leaving a note on my door saying, "Don't back down," and even one former board volunteer reaching out anonymously to say that the pressure tactics were discussed internally more than once, and when my attorney brought that information into the room, the HOA attorney's face tightened, because whistleblowers change leverage instantly, and by the end of the day, the HOA was no longer negotiating from strength but from fear, offering broader concessions, including policy revisions and oversight, yet still resisting one thing above all else, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Because that was the piece that couldn't be erased, and as mediation adjourned without a final agreement, my attorney told me this was exactly where we wanted them, because the longer this dragged on, the more likely the story would escape the neighborhood and enter public record, something HOAs hate more than fines. And sure enough, within days, local housing advocates reached out after seeing the complaint filing, asking questions about selective enforcement and displacement tactics, and the HOA's sudden friendliness turned into frantic damage control, sending emails about unity and transparency while quietly updating bylaws on their website, changes that only made sense if they were trying to erase past behavior, and as discovery requests were formally served, demanding internal communications related to enforcement, signage, and homeowner classifications. The HOA attempted one last pressure move, sending a letter warning that continued legal action could negatively impact community stability, a line so ironic it almost made me laugh, because stability had never been their concern. Control had, and as I watched them scramble to contain something they'd assumed would never be challenged, I understood that the real suspense wasn't whether they'd lose, it was how much of the truth would surface before they realized there was no way to put it back once it was out. Discovery cracked everything wide open in a way mediation never could, because once the HOA was legally forced to hand over internal emails, text messages, and meeting notes, the story they'd tried to control slipped completely out of their hands. And as my attorney reviewed the documents, the language was colder and more calculated than I ever imagined. Board members openly discussing which homeowners were easier to push, which ones might leave if pressured subtly, and which houses they wanted vacated to attract better buyers. A phrase that appeared often enough to stop feeling accidental, and buried among those messages was the smoking gun, an email chain approving the installation of the for sale sign as a psychological nudge, complete with instructions to remove it quickly if challenged, which explained the early morning disappearance perfectly. And when my attorney showed me that email, I didn't feel anger so much as clarity, because the doubt was gone, replaced by proof, and once that evidence was formally submitted, the HOA's legal posture collapsed almost overnight, their attorney requesting emergency settlement talks, this time without conditions, and when negotiations resumed, the board didn't even pretend anymore, offering a full settlement that included financial compensation, policy reforms, independent oversight, and most importantly, a public written apology acknowledging wrongdoing, discrimination, and unauthorized actions, a term they'd fought harder than anything else but now couldn't avoid. And as the settlement finalized, the apology was distributed to every homeowner, posted publicly, and recorded in official filings, permanently tying the HOA's name to its own actions. And the shift in the neighborhood was immediate, because silence lifted, neighbors talked openly, shared stories, questioned rules, and attended meetings in numbers the board had never seen. And within weeks, 2 board members resigned, citing personal reasons, while another was formally removed. And when the next HOA election came around, the seats were filled by people who had once been warned to stay quiet, people who now understood exactly how power could be abused when left unchecked, and as for the "for sale" sign, it never returned, but its absence became louder than its presence ever was, a reminder that intimidation only works until someone refuses to move. And on a quiet evening months later, as I stood on my lawn where the sign once stood, neighbors walked by and waved, some smiling, some nodding with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before, and I realized the HOA hadn't just lost a case, it had lost the illusion of absolute authority, and the settlement money mattered less than the precedent, because policies were rewritten, oversight committees formed, and enforcement rules clarified in ways that protected everyone, not just me. And when a new homeowner moved in down the street, there were no whispered warnings, no quiet pressure, just normal introductions and borrowed tools, and sometimes I think about how close I came to believing the lie they planted on my lawn, how easy it would have been to accept the story they told and quietly disappear. But instead, the truth forced its way into the open, and the same system that tried to erase me ended up exposing itself. And that's the part they never planned for, because when control depends on silence, all it takes is one person refusing to stay quiet for the whole structure to start cracking. And as the neighborhood settled into something calmer and more honest, I understood that the real ending wasn't the apology or the settlement, it was the fact that no one in that community would ever look at an HOA notice the same way again, because now they knew exactly how far things could go when no one pushed back, and exactly how fast it could all unravel once someone finally did. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.